With the release of Chapter 5, the landscape of Deltarune theories has changed completely. Despite Chapter 5 not being as lore-heavy as previous chapters, with Toby even referring to it as one last fun adventure, there are still plenty of reveals that have recontextualized many parts of the game, such as Fred's relationship with the eggs in Spamton in the shopkeeper dialogue, the whole situation with Gaster, a normal NPC, and most importantly, the ending of Weirdroot, or Side B as it's called now. Through everything that we have learned in the past 3 chapters, though, there is still one theory that has been on my mind as of late. One that comes from the pre-Chapter 3 and 4 era. A theory that, despite its age, still holds up and seems to be gathering more evidence with each chapter's release, and could potentially solve the identity of the Knight and the rest of Deltarune. This, of course, is the theory that Kris is dead. The idea of Kris being a dead body that is controlled by the soul stems from the many allusions to them possessing zombie-like traits. The most obvious examples of this are the scenes where Kris rips the soul out of their chests, with their movements being very zombie-like. Now, obviously, this isn't nearly enough evidence to prove that Kris is dead, which is where some of the more obscure hints come in. When you first enter the Dark World in Chapter 1, the description for Kris in the spells menu is human body with a human soul. The wording of this is interesting. Kris is referred to as just a body, which makes them sound very impersonal and lifeless. During the school section of Chapter 2, Susie refers to Kris as the school zombie, and mentions that they were, quote, sleeping like a corpse. Another, more recent example of this is at the beginning of the Chapter 5 Weirdroot, where, after Kris crawls out of their bed, they have a noticeably green skin tone, which is similar to a zombie or a rotting corpse. There are other small references to Kris being harmed or dead in some way, which you can see yourself in this video by Half-Bred Chaos. It's where this whole theory was popularized in the first place, and it's a good watch, so I recommend you go watch it after you're done watching this video, of course. Speaking of that video, there is one very interesting piece of evidence that I've been hung up on. You see, when Kris falls into the Dark World in Chapter 1, there's a certain audio that's played before they get up. Take a listen. Now, you may recognize this audio as being ocean.ogg. When this theory first popped up, people came up with the idea that this was alluding to Kris drowning, which would explain why their skin was blue in the Dark World. This didn't really mean much at the time. It seemed to be nothing more than an interesting world-building tidbit, and all it would really explain is why Kris is moving so awkwardly. However, as you could imagine, the concept of Kris drowning is of much more interest after the Chapter 5 Weirdroot. So, now that we know that there are hints to Kris being dead throughout the game, and that it's connected to the water and potentially drowning, how does this connect to the Weirdroot? The obvious answer is that all of these clues were just examples of foreshadowing, and were ultimately unimportant in the grand scheme of things. But, let's just put on our tinfoil hats for a second and get a little crazy. And for that, we're gonna have to discuss Crystal Amalgamite theory. I know. Just put down your pitchforks for a second and just hear me out. Although many of you have probably already heard about this theory, I'll still give a summary here for those who have not. The way this theory goes is that the Weirdroot is the backstory for the creation of the Knight. After Kris and Noelle drowned in the lake, they fused to create the Knight, which would explain the Amalgamite properties the Knight has. Now, with their newfound powers, the Knight resets the story and forces himself into the timeline, thus kicking into motion the events of Deltarune. There are other smaller pieces of evidence that support this idea, with the amount of references to Noelle and the Knight's design in their fight, Kris sharing many poses with the Knight, etc, etc. I won't go into the full details because not everything is super important to what I'm talking about in this video, but if you want to learn more, I recommend watching this video by JR Vanity. Now, you might be wondering, why bring this up? After all, the Amalgamite theory isn't the most well-liked theory among the community, so why try and spark another discussion with it? Well, that's because I believe that Kris potentially being dead ties this theory together and fixes many of the problems with it. My main problem originally with the theory was that Kris felt a little shoehorned in. Yeah, their poses are similar to the Knights, and we know that Kris has a deep involvement with the Knight, but Kris actually being the Knight, or at least part of it, always felt strange, and the whole fusing thing felt a little far-fetched. Luckily, I believe I have come up with a series of events that flow together in a satisfying way. First, the setup to the weird root happens. Then, the infamous lake scene occurs, where Noelle pushes Kris to proceed, causing them to drown at the bottom of the lake. With Kris dead, Noelle harnesses Kris's determination and powers to become the Roaring Knight. With her new power, she resets the timeline and brings Kris's lifeless body back to the beginning, and infuses them with determination and the soul. The idea of Noelle, a monster, being able to absorb the determination of Kris may seem unfounded. However, this exact same series of events has happened before in Undertale, with an eerie amount of similarities. At the end of the neutral route, the monsters come together to tell the story of Asgore's child. The story follows Asriel, finding a human that had just fallen down into the underground. Over time, these two create an inseparable bond, with them being described as, quote, like siblings. However, as time goes on, the human becomes more and more ill, eventually leading to their death. Asriel, filled with grief, absorbs the human soul and gains immense power. This story shows us that a monster absorbing a human's power is possible, and that Noelle likely absorbed Kris's determination and soul to become the Knight. There is one other part about Asriel's character that is of interest for this video. After Asriel transforms into the god of hyperdeath, he tells the player that he does not care about destroying the world anymore. Rather, he wants to reset the timeline and go back to the beginning. Sound familiar? This story is almost identical to the Weird Root, with Kris as a stand-in for the human and Noelle for Asriel. Kris slowly deteriorates over time, eventually leading to their death, with Noelle there to absorb their power and use that power to fulfill her desire of resetting the timeline. Now that we know how Noelle could have turned into the Knight, it's important to discuss the ramifications this would have. Not only would the Knight being purely Noelle explain the disproportionate amount of references the Knight has to Noelle compared to Kris, but it would also explain the relationship Kris has with the Soul and the Knight. It's pretty clear that Kris doesn't really like the Soul, with them, ripping it out all the time and throwing it in the cage, in the trash can, but this theory explains a deeper meaning for that hatred. Not only do they not like being piloted around by an outside force, but they hate having a constant reminder of what they did to Noelle, how they ruined their innocent friend's life. In regards to their relationship with the Knight, the reason Kris is so complicit with the Knight's actions is because of who is behind the helmet. To Kris, Noelle is the last link to their younger, happier self, the time when Des was still around, when their parents were still together, and when Noelle was still happy. Kris knows the power that the Knight possesses, and they know that they have seriously hurt Noelle, so they try to make it up to her in any way they can, even if that means endangering their friends and family in the process. With all of that said, I wanted to talk about some of the issues with this theory. First, let's address the elephant in the room, and that is Des Knight. This isn't really direct evidence against the dead Kris Noelle Knight time loop theory, but more so another theory that just has so much supporting evidence that it's hard not to believe. I don't have to go super in depth talking about Des Knight. Everyone and their grandma knows about it, and there's like a million different videos talking about it. Don't get me wrong, it's fun to talk about other Knight theories, and I'm not saying that any Knight theory that isn't Des doesn't have merit. I'm just saying that there's so much evidence in plain text that Des is the Knight that it's hard to sell any theory that doesn't involve Des. Another issue with this theory is that, like I had mentioned previously, all of the clues regarding Kris being dead could be for the sake of foreshadowing. Toby Fox is a good writer, and I think it's entirely reasonable that he would rather use the idea of Kris being dead, whether literally or symbolically, as subtle foreshadowing, rather than an obscure detail that the average player wouldn't be spending hours looking into just to predict the ending of the game. The final problem with this theory is one that I've been thinking about in regards to any crackpot Deltarune theory, and that's that it's just too convoluted. I'm not going to pretend I know the thought process of Toby while he was writing Deltarune, but I'm confident in saying that a theory this out there probably wouldn't end up being true. Something you have to remember is that when Deltarune is finished, the way we engage with the game is going to be changed entirely. We'll be able to experience the story in its entirety without several years in between chapters, which I think will make us realize that the plot wasn't as cryptic as we initially thought, and that the truth behind mysteries such as Gaster, the Knight, and Friend are able to be explained by just playing through the game, and not by losing our minds trying to find the meaning behind every pixel while waiting for the next chapter. Who knows though? Maybe I could be wrong about that, and maybe the answer was predicted in some insane theory like the one I just talked about. That's about everything I wanted to talk about in regards to this series. This is my first ever time making a YouTube video like this, so I'm curious to hear feedback about the theory and just the video as a whole. I don't know if I'll ever try to make something like this again. I only have like 170 subscribers, so I doubt this will get much traction, but if it does, that'd be pretty cool. If you're curious about sources and anything, every video or transcript that I showed will be linked in the description. I recommend giving them a look, especially those two videos I mentioned. Even if you don't agree with the theories, I think they're really well made. So yeah, that's been about it for me, so I will see you around.